Hi, this is Mrs. Chavez. Today we're going to be starting part 2 of Chapter 34, An Age of Anxiety. Lenin and the Bolsheviks soon gained control of the Petrograd Soviets as well as the Soviets in other major Russian cities. And by the fall of 1917, people in the cities were rallying to the call, all power to the Soviets. Lenin's slogan was peace, land, and bread, and that gained widespread appeal to the people when Lenin decided to take action. In November of 1917, without any warning at all, armed factory workers stormed the Winter Palace in Petrograd. Calling themselves the Bolshevik Red Guards, they took over the government offices and arrested the leaders of the provisional government. Kerensky disappeared almost as quickly as the Tsar's regime that had replaced. Within days after the takeover, Lenin ordered that all farmland be distributed among the peasants. Lenin and the Bolsheviks gave control of the factories to the workers. The Bolshevik government also signed a truce with Germany to stop all fighting and began peace talks and eventual pullout from the war, from World War I. So in March of 1918, Russia and Germany signed this treaty, and the Bolsheviks now were faced with a new challenge, stamping out their enemies at home. Their opponents formed the White Army. The White Army was made up of very different groups of people. There were people who supported the return of rule by the Tsar. There were others who wanted a democratic government. There were socialists who opposed Lenin's style of socialism. Only the desire to defeat the Bolsheviks united the White Army. The groups barely cooperated with each other, and at one point there were actually 3 White Armies fighting against the Bolshevik Red Army. Around 14 million Russians died during this deadly civil war. Russia was in chaos. In the end, the Red Army crushed all opposition, and the victory showed that the Bolsheviks were able to seize power and maintain it. In March of 1921, Lenin temporarily put aside his plan for the state-controlled economy and instead resorted to a small-scale version of capitalism called the New Economic Policy. So the reforms under the NEP allowed peasants to sell their surplus crops instead of turning them over to the government. The government still kept control of the major industries, banks, and communication and transportation, but it let some small factories and businesses and farms operate under private ownership. The government also encouraged foreign investment. Slowly, the country began to recover. Well, Lenin suffered a stroke in 1922. He survived it, but the incident set in motion this competition for who's going to head up the Communist Party. 2 of the most notable men were Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. Stalin was a cold, hard, and impersonal man. During his early days as a Bolshevik, he changed his name to Stalin, which means man of steel in Russian, and the name fit well. Stalin began his ruthless climb to the head of the government between 1922 and 1927. In 1922, as General Secretary of the Communist Party, he worked behind the scenes to move his supporters into positions of power. Lenin believed that Stalin was a dangerous man, and shortly before he died in 1924, Lenin wrote, "Comrade Stalin had concentrated enormous power in his hands, and I'm not sure that he always knows how to use that power with sufficient caution." By 1928, Stalin was in total command of the Communist Party, and Trotsky was forced into exile in 1929 and was no longer a threat to Stalin. Stalin now stood poised to wield absolute power as a dictator. Now, as Stalin began to gain complete control of society, he was setting plans in motion to overhaul the economy. In 1928, Stalin's plans called for a command economy, a system in which the government made all economic decisions. Under this system, political leaders identified the country's economic needs and then they determined how to fill them. Stalin outlined the first of several 5-year plans, the Gosplan. The 5-year plans set impossibly high quotas or numerical goals to increase the output of steel, coal, oil, and electricity. And to reach these targets, the government limited production of consumer goods. As a result, people faced severe shortages of housing, food, clothing, and other necessary goods. Stalin's tough methods produced impressive economic results, though. Although most of the targets of his first 5-year plan fell short, the Soviets made substantial gains. A second plan, launched in 1922, proved equally successful. From 1928 to 1937, industrial production of steel increased more than 25%. In 1928, the government began to seize over 25 million privately owned farms in the USSR. It combined them into large government-owned farms called collective farms. Hundreds of families worked on these farms called collectives, producing food for the state. The government expected that the modern machinery on the collective farms would boost food production and reduce the number of workers. But resistance was especially strong among the kulaks, a class of wealthy peasants. The Soviet government decided that he was going to eliminate them, and they did. Peasants actively fought the government's attempt to take over their land, and many killed livestock and destroyed crops in protest. Soviet secret police herded peasants onto collective farms at the point of a bayonet. Between 5 million and 10 million peasants died as a direct result of Stalin's agricultural revolution. Stalin set up state farms then that operated like factories, and these were much more productive for the state. The workers in these state farms received wages and instead of share the profits, but these farms were much larger than collectives and mostly produced wheat. By the mid-1930s, Stalin had forcibly transformed the Soviet Union into a totalitarian regime and an industrial political power too. He stood unopposed as dictator and maintained his authority over the Communist Party. Stalin would not tolerate individual creativity. He saw it as a threat to conformity and obedience and required of citizens in a totalitarian state. He ushered in a period of total social control and rule by terror rather than a constitutional government. Fascism was a new militant political movement that emphasized loyalty to the state and obedience to its leaders. Unlike communism, fascism had no clear, defined political theory or program. Nevertheless, most fascists shared several ideas. They preached an extreme form of nationalism or loyalty to one's country, and fascists believed that nations must struggle. Peaceful states were doomed to be conquered. They pledged loyalty to an authoritarian leader who guided and brought order to the state. In each nation, fascists wore uniforms of a certain color and used special salutes and held mass rallies. But in some ways, fascism was similar to communism, but fascists were violently anti-communist. Both systems, fascism and communism, were ruled by dictators who allowed only their own political party, one-party rule. Both denied individual rights, and in both the state was supreme. Neither practiced any kind of democracy. However, unlike communists, fascists did not seek a classless society. They believed that each class had its place and function. In most cases, fascist parties were made up of aristocrats and industrialists, war veterans, and the lower middle class. Also, fascists were nationalists and communists were internationalists, hoping to unite workers throughout the world. Fascism's rise in Italy was fueled by bitter disappointment over the failure to win large territorial gains at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference after World War I. Rising inflation and unemployment contributed to widespread social unrest also. To growing numbers of Italians, their democratic government seemed helpless to deal with the country's problems. They wanted a strong leader who would take action. There was a newspaper editor and politician named Benito Mussolini, and he boldly promised to rescue Italy by reviving its economy and rebuilding its armed forces. He vowed to give Italy strong leadership. Now, Mussolini had founded the Fascist Party in 1919. As economic conditions worsened, of course, his popularity rapidly increased. Finally, Mussolini publicly criticized the Italian government. Groups of fascists wearing black shirts attacked communists and socialists on the streets. Because Mussolini played on the fear of the worker revolt, he began to win support from the middle class, the aristocracy, and the industrial leaders. In October 1922, about 30,000 of Mussolini's fascists marched on Rome. They demanded that King Victor Emmanuel III put Mussolini in charge of the government. The king decided that Mussolini was the best hope for his dynasty to survive. After widespread violence and a threatened uprising, Mussolini took power legally. Mussolini was now Il Duce, or the leader. He abolished democracy and outlawed all political parties except the fascist. Secret police jailed his opponents. Government censors forced radio stations and publications to broadcast only on fascist doctrines. Mussolini outlawed strikes. He tried to control the economy by allying the fascists with the industrialists and large landowners. However, Mussolini never had the total control achieved by Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union or Adolf Hitler in Germany. Well, we're moving from Italy over to Germany and to Adolf Hitler. Now, Adolf Hitler was little known. He was a political leader whose early life had been really marked by disappointment. When World War I broke out, Hitler found a new beginning. He volunteered for the German army and was twice awarded the Iron Cross for bravery. At the end of the war, Hitler settled in Munich, and in 1919 he joined a tiny right-wing political group. This group shared his belief that Germany had to overturn the Treaty of Versailles and combat communism. The group later named itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi for short. Its policies formed the German brand of fascism known as Nazism. The party adopted the swastika as its symbol, and the Nazis set up a private militia called the Brown Shirts. Within a short time, Hitler's success as an organizer and speaker led him to be chosen as the Führer, or leader, of the Nazi Party. Inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, Hitler and the Nazis plotted to seize power in Munich in 1923. However, this attempt failed, and Hitler was arrested. He was tried for treason, but was sentenced to only 5 years in prison. He served less than 9 months there. But while he was in jail, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, his book called My Struggle. This book set forth his beliefs and his goals for Germany. Hitler asserted that the Germans, whom he incorrectly called Aryans, were a master race. He declared that non-Aryan races such as Jews, Slavs, and Gypsies were inferior. He called the Versailles Treaty an outrage and vowed to regain German lands. Hitler also declared that Germany was overcrowded and needed more Lebensraum, or living space. He promised to get space by conquering Eastern Europe and Russia. Well, after leaving prison in 1924, Hitler revived the Nazi Party. Most Germans ignored him, and his angry messages until the Great Depression ended the nation's brief post-war recovery. When American loans stopped, the German economy collapsed. Civil unrest broke out. Frightened and confused, Germans now turned to Hitler, hoping for security and a strong leader. The Nazis had become the largest political party by 1932. Conservative leaders mistakenly believed they could control Hitler and use him for their purposes. In January of 1933, they advised President Paul von Hindenburg to name Hitler chancellor. Thus, Hitler came to power legally also, just like Mussolini. Once in office, Hitler called for new elections. Hoping to win a parliamentary majority, 6 days before the election, though, a fire destroyed the Reichstag building where Parliament met. The Nazis conveniently blamed the communists. By stirring up the fear of communists, the Nazis and their allies won by a very slim margin, though. Hitler used his power to turn Germany into a totalitarian state. He banned all other political parties and had opponents arrested. Meanwhile, an elite black uniformed unit called the SS was created. It was loyal only to Hitler. In 1934, the SS arrested and murdered hundreds of Hitler's enemies. Now, this brutal action and the terror applied by the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, shocked most Germans into total obedience. The Nazis quickly took command of the economy. New laws banned strikes, dissolved independent labor unions, and gave the government authority over business and labor. Hitler put millions of Germans to work. They constructed factories, and they built highways and manufactured weapons and served in the military. And as a result, the number of unemployed dropped from about 6 million to 1.5 million by 1936. Hitler was ambitious. He wanted more than just economic and political power. He wanted control over every aspect of German life. To shape public opinion and to win praise for his leadership, Hitler turned the press, radio, literature, painting, and film into propaganda tools. Books that didn't conform to Nazi beliefs were burned in huge bonfires. Churches were forbidden to criticize the Nazi government. School children had to join either the Hitler Youth for Boys or the League of German Girls. Hitler believed that continuous struggle brought victory to the strong. He twisted the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche to support his use of brute force. Hatred of Jews or anti-Semitism was a key part of the Nazi ideology. Although Jews were less than 1% of the population, the Nazis used them as scapegoats for all of Germany's troubles since World War I. This led to a wave of anti-Semitism across Germany. Beginning in 1933, the Nazis passed the Nuremberg Laws, which deprived Jews of most of their rights as German citizens. Violence against the Jews mounted. On the night of November the 9th, 1938, the Nazi mobs attacked Jews in their homes and on the streets and destroyed thousands of Jewish-owned buildings and businesses. The rampage, called Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass, signaled the real start of the process of eliminating Jews from German life.